This is a quilting project I set up. This project had 11 repeats and it had 6 rows. I'm using this small stipple pattern. It's a small stipple edge to edge. And I noticed that after I started quilting, I was going to have a problem with this quilt shrinking. I should have stopped earlier and tried to correct the problem, but I did not. You know how it is. You think it's going to work out, and quite a few times it doesn't work out. So I quilted on this until I got all the way down to the last row. I had quilted all of the rows except the bottom row. And when I got to the bottom, I noticed that I had such an excess in the bottom border, on the edge and on the border itself, that there was no way that I was going to be able to correct this problem. So I've just selected everything and toggled it as sewn, and then toggled the last repeat as unsewn. So I worked on this and I tried to figure out how I could make this work. And I decided the only way that I was going to be able to correct this was to take out the stitching in the 2 rows above the bottom. So now I'll have an area that is 3 rows of this quilt that's going to be unsewn. I'm just going to toggle these now as unsewn, give you an idea what I have. I have these last 3 rows at the bottom as unsewn. So I removed all the stitching in these 2 rows here. Then I looked at this and tried to figure out how is the best way that we're going to do this. So Jean and I laid this quilt out on the table, and we worked on getting all of this smooth, and pinned it. And Jean put in some stay stitching in this bottom border on the quilt and worked that all in. And when I brought the quilt back out, okay, this is the top as I started, the top quilting down. I decided that the best way to do this would be to put this bottom edge on the canvas, on the take-up roller. And I looked at this and okay, now how are you going to make all of this work out? Because I'm quilting down the quilt from the top to the bottom, and when I switch this around, I'm going to be quilting from the top edge towards the bottom edge. Now you can look at this pattern. If we look at it very closely, we can see that the start and end of the pattern is at the bottom. So as I work down, when I get to the last row, the start and end is going to be at the bottom of the quilt. And here's what I decided to do. I decided that I would select everything, and I would simply flip the entire pattern field vertically to see what happens. Now, doing this, if you look at it carefully, since the pattern is set up the way it is, it's going to want to start at this row, the 3rd row down, and it's going to want to quilt it first. To keep this quilt stabilized, I decided I wanted to quilt this bottom row first. So I decided the best thing to do was to toggle these two rows as sewn. That way, I would look at this, and if we carefully examine, my start and point is at the very top now. And that makes sense because remember, I'm quilting this in the opposite direction. This is the bottom of the quilt, and that's where I want the start and the end point to be along the bottom edge. Then I decided, since I was having a problem with shrinkage, that I would change the sewing order on this, and I would quilt from the center to the right and from the center to the left. Well, there's 11 repeats, so I can't exactly center it. So I decided I would leave 6 repeats unsewn, or 6 repeats here on the left side that I would sew from the center to the left, and 5 repeats I would sew from the center to the right. I only need 3 rows, so it made sense to me. Why not remove all of the rows down in this area that I don't need? Now I only need these 3 rows to work with. Then I thought, well, there's also going to be a problem because of sewing order. How do I want to stitch this thing? Notice that, remember, I flipped the entire pattern field vertically. So now the sewing order is going to be with this row, this row, this row. So I toggled these 2 rows as sewn, and that only gave me this row that I needed to work with. I'm going to go in, I'm going to change the sewing order. Press the F8 key. Here we have the sewing order, and it is showing us that it's 0 through 10, and 11 through 21, and 22 through 32. But I want to sew this row from 5 repeats to in the center to the right edge, and then the 6 repeats from the center over to the left edge. So I'm going to do some changes to the sewing order. I'm also going to have to change the direction of sewing of all of these repeats from the center to the left. And remember, there's going to be 6 of them. So these, I'm going to change the sewing order, or change the direction first. I want it to sew backwards. I'll go and change all of those. Looking at this carefully, we can see that we have 2 numbers right here close together. So I want to make this going to the right. I'm going to change the 27. I'm going to click on it and make it 0. And I'll do that all the way across. Okay, I've gone through and I've changed the sewing order of only this top row. And if we carefully examine this, we're going to see that right in this area right here, there's 2 numbers, 0. Then we go to the right, we'll find 1, and to go through 5. Then it comes back to 6 and 7 and 8 and to the left. So that should give me the correct order that I want this to sew in. I'm going to do a virtual stitch out to make sure that my sewing order is in fact correct, and it's going to stitch in the order that I want it to. Right now it's looking at sewing from starting with the 7th repeat, sewing to the right, and we'll see what happens when we get to the end of this. I like the virtual stitch out now since we can run it much faster than we could before. It's coming to the end of the right side, is sewing the last repeat, and it should jump over and start at the right edge of what's left, and then sew to all the way to the left to the end of that row. Okay, it's nearing the last end of the last repeat on the left side of the quilt. Alright, it's all finished, and that row will be sewn. I'm doing this in SAM, so now I'm going to toggle that row sewn. I toggle the second row as unsewn, so we could see if I was actually on the machine, I would do this, then I would click quilt, and the machine would go to the start point of this second row, and it would take a stitch right here at the start point. I would pull up the bobbin thread, cut the bobbin thread underneath, and would secure this thread to a pin. That's going to be my reference point for relocate. But I decided that I did not want to sew the second row. I wanted to sew the third row. So what I would do was, after I mark this point, I would go ahead and roll the quilt, and I'm going to sew this area here. After I roll the quilt, I would do another relocate, but now this time I'm thinking I don't want to go and change the sewing order and the direction of sewing from these two rows, from say the center to the right, center to the left. I'd have to change the use F8, change the sewing order. I'd have to reverse the start and end on all of these repeats on this side and that row, and then also in this row. Remember, I have this row sewn, and I want to sew this row next. So what I'm going to do is, and I said I hit quilt, I toggle this row as unsewn, I hit quilt, and I went and marked this point. Now I'm going to roll the quilt, and I'm going to toggle this row as sewn and toggle the bottom row as unsewn, and let the machine go to this point so that I can mark this point. Then I'll have two reference points, one here and one here. That row sewn, I'm going to sew this one next once I get it all set up. I'll draw a boundary. Remember, this is quilted down here, and I have this edge of this row that's been quilted to use to draw a boundary line. And I'll draw a boundary line, and I'll make sure that this is going to fit within the boundary that I want, and I'm going to stitch this row. However, I'm not going to use this row to do the stitching. I'm going to use this top row. So after I've got this point marked, I will go up here, and I will use relocate, shift all to one point, and I will shift this point right to there, and I will use this to sew this row. The reason I want to do that is because I already have the sewing order set. I don't want to take time to change the sewing order in all three of these rows. This row, I'll toggle it as unsewn, and I'll toggle this row back to sewn again, and I will simply toggle this as unsewn, and I'll relocate it, and it will stitch right in here. Remember, it'll stitch from the center to the right and from the center to the left. And after I get this stitched in this area, I will again select it and toggle it as unsewn. I'll roll my quilt away in the right position. I'll use the bottom edge of this row and the top edge of this row here, and I'll draw a boundary, and I will make this row fit right in between these two. Before I ever started, I made sure that the amount of pattern in these 3 rows was set to the height of the amount of quilt that was left to stitch. Now this is one way to get yourself out of a problem like this, where you have a severe shrinkage problem occurring and you can't keep it straight down the edges. You can quilt from the center to the right and from the center to the left, and this will help you prevent that type of problem.